It started with a sound no one had time to fear. Not the roar of an engine, not the crack of thunder, just a low, hollow rumble, almost like distant artillery. It rolled down from the peaks like a growl from the belly of the mountain itself. And then, in less than a second, the entire sky turned white. At 3:57 p.m. on February 23, 1999, the Tyrolean village of Galtür, nestled deep in the Austrian Alps, was struck by an avalanche so fast, so powerful, and so violent that it flattened concrete buildings like matchboxes and tossed cars into the air like toys. It didn't sweep gently downhill. It exploded. Walls of snow tore through the village at over 180 miles per hour. What wasn't crushed was suffocated. What wasn't buried was blown apart. In just seconds, 57 people were caught in the whiteout. Entire families vanished. Survivors clawed blindly at the snow, screaming for loved ones they couldn't hear, couldn't see. And the worst part? The disaster didn't come without warning. It came after weeks of red flags, after years of reckless development, after decades of pretending nature could be controlled. But the mountain doesn't care about maps. It doesn't read safety reports. And on that day in 1999, it reminded everyone in its path who was really in charge. Galtür was no stranger to snow. It's a postcard-perfect Alpine village, stone chalets with sloped roofs, winding streets, towering pines. Skiers loved it. Locals thrived off the winter tourism economy. And nestled at the end of the Paznan Valley in western Austria, it seemed protected, even cozy, surrounded by ridgelines that kept the worst of the weather at bay. But that was an illusion. For centuries, the region had recorded avalanches, some big, some small, some deadly. In fact, one had struck Galtür before, way back in 1951. But since then, the town had modernized. New roads, new hotels, new ski lifts, and a growing belief that avalanche science had solved the problem. They built snow fences, planted protective trees, created zones meant to break the snow's momentum. Reports were written, risk assessments performed. But as tourism boomed, so did construction, expanding into areas that had once been clear for a reason. By the 1990s, dozens of new buildings had been erected right in the so-called Blue Zone, a region previously flagged as being at elevated risk from avalanches. But the zoning maps had quietly shifted. Pressure from developers and local authorities had overridden old warnings. The profits were good. The snow was better than ever. And that winter, the danger came back. January and February of 1999 brought record snowfalls across the Alps. In just a few weeks, over 4 meters of snow piled onto the mountains surrounding Galtür, well above average. Storm after storm rolled through, interspersed with brief thaws and freezes. This created what's known as a weak layer, a fragile shelf of granular snow beneath heavier, compacted snow on top. Avalanche experts in the region warned of the risk. The danger level was raised to high, level 4 on a 5-point European scale. Some areas nearby were even marked at the maximum. Level 5, very high. But the ski lifts kept running. Tourists kept arriving. Hotels stayed open. Even when small avalanches were triggered in the surrounding peaks, most assumed the village itself, down in the valley, was safe. They were wrong. On the afternoon of February 23rd, the mountains gave way. A massive slab of snow, hundreds of meters wide, broke loose from the Grieskogel mountain just north of the village. It descended rapidly, gathering speed and mass, until it hit a steep section of terrain that funneled it like a bullet into the valley floor. But this wasn't just a powder avalanche, the fluffy kind people imagine with skiers outrunning the spray. This was a powder dust avalanche, a rare and catastrophic event where heavy snow mixes with air and superheats, creating a pressure wave. It hit the village at nearly 300 kilometers per hour. The force of the blast shattered windows 100 meters away. Concrete apartment buildings collapsed in on themselves. A school gym was destroyed. Trees snapped like twigs. A bus was flipped over and buried. In total, 57 people were trapped, some buried under up to 12 meters of snow. The silence that followed was chilling. And then came the screams. Rescue teams faced a nightmare. Galtür was cut off, roads impassable, power lines down. Snow kept falling. There were fears of secondary avalanches. Helicopters couldn't land in the whiteout. Local rescuers, many of them volunteers, used shovels and bare hands to dig. They found survivors in pockets of air, shivering, bloodied, clinging to hope. But they also found the dead. Families huddled together, a group of children buried in a collapsed hotel. One British woman survived for over 24 hours beneath the snow before being pulled out, barely alive. On day 2, the Austrian army launched Operation Avalanche. Over 1,000 soldiers were mobilized. Specialized teams from Switzerland, Germany, and Italy arrived. Dogs sniffed through the wreckage. Drones scanned for heat signatures. Still, the death toll climbed. By the end of the week, 31 people were confirmed dead. Dozens more were injured. The youngest victim was just 4 years old. And as the snow settled, the questions began. How did this happen? The avalanche itself wasn't unprecedented. It wasn't even the largest on record. But the impact, the devastation, was magnified by human error. Experts quickly discovered that many of the buildings destroyed had been constructed in high-risk zones, areas once marked off-limits. Those avalanche zoning maps had been revised in the 80s and 90s. New developments were pushed forward despite objections from scientists. Protective structures had not been built high enough. Fences had failed. One building that collapsed had been labeled safe for avalanche shelter during a previous storm. It wasn't nature alone that caused the disaster. It was the belief that nature could be managed. The tragedy at Galtür triggered a full-scale reckoning across Europe. Thousands of similar Alpine villages reevaluated their risk zones. Austria invested millions in new avalanche defenses, steel nets, reinforced barriers, early warning systems. Helicopter-borne avalanche blasting became more common, forcing snow to release in controlled conditions. In Galtür, the rebuilding took years. Today, the village is back, the ski lifts run, the hotels are open. But beneath the charm lies a quiet awareness. Plaques and memorials line the village square. Survivors remember the white wall, the silence, the desperate digging. Some never returned, and those who did never forgot. The mountain is not cruel. It's not angry. It doesn't hate or forgive. It just is. And when we build too close, ignore too many warnings, and believe we can outthink it, we find ourselves buried in the consequences. On that day in 1999, Galtür learned the truth too late, and the snow kept falling. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.